The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of the Beaumont Estate auction house in New Orleans, casting long shadows across tables crowded with forgotten relics. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a curator from the National Museum of African American History, moved slowly through the rows, her trained eyes scanning each item with practiced precision. She had driven 3 hours from Washington, D.C., for this estate sale, hoping to find artifacts that could fill gaps in the museum's Reconstruction-era collection. Most of what she saw was unremarkable. Tarnished silverware, faded quilts, brittle newspapers yellowed with age. The air smelled of mildew and old wood, that particular scent of time's passage that clung to abandoned estates. But then, tucked inside a warped wooden box beneath a pile of moth-eaten linens, she found it. A photograph, sealed in a cracked glass frame. The image was sepia-toned and remarkably well-preserved, showing a black family of 5 standing before a simple wooden house. The father stood tall and dignified, one hand resting on his wife's shoulder. 3 daughters, ranging from perhaps 8 to 16 years old, stood in descending height order, their expressions serious, as was customary for photographs of that era. Sarah carefully lifted the frame, her heart quickening. Photographs of formerly enslaved families from this period were rare. Most couldn't afford such luxuries, and those who could were often too fearful to be documented. The back of the frame bore a faded inscription in elegant script. The Freeman family, Ascension Parish, Louisiana, June 1872. She paid for the photograph without hesitation, barely hearing the auctioneer's price. The frame felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried the weight of untold stories. Back in her hotel room that evening, Sarah placed the frame under a magnifying lamp and began her preliminary examination. The composition was formal but intimate, a family claiming their identity, their dignity, their place, in a world that had only recently recognized their humanity. The father wore a simple but clean suit. The mother's dress was modest, her hair wrapped in a patterned cloth. The girls wore matching dresses, clearly handmade, with careful stitching, visible even in the photograph. It was while examining the eldest daughter's dress that Sarah first noticed it. Along the hem and across the bodice ran an intricate pattern of geometric shapes, diamonds, triangles, and cross-hatching that seemed almost too deliberate, too complex to be merely decorative. Sarah leaned closer, her breath catching. She had seen patterns like this before, in her research on Underground Railroad quilts and coded messages used by enslaved people seeking freedom. But this was 1872. The Civil War had ended 7 years earlier. Slavery was abolished. Why would someone need a secret code now? Sarah's mind raced with possibilities as she stared at the photograph, unable to look away from that intricate pattern stitched into the fabric of history itself. Sarah barely slept that night. She sat cross-legged on the hotel bed, her laptop open beside the photograph, comparing the dress pattern to images in her research database. The geometric shapes weren't random decorative elements. They followed a systematic arrangement, repeating in specific sequences that suggested intentionality. By 3 a.m, she had photographed the image from multiple angles under different lighting conditions, each exposure revealing new details in the fabric's weave and the stitching's precision. The pattern seemed to shimmer under certain angles, as though the person who had stitched it had intentionally created depth and dimension. The next morning, she cut her trip short and drove straight back to Washington. The highway stretched before her, but her mind remained fixed on that photograph, on the young woman whose dress held secrets. In her office at the museum, Sarah assembled a team. Dr. Marcus Webb, a textile historian who specialized in 19th century African American craftwork, arrived first. He was a tall man in his 60s, with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on his nose. When Sarah showed him the photograph, he stood motionless for nearly a minute, studying it in silence. "Where did you find this?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Estate sale in New Orleans. Do you see what I'm seeing?" Marcus pulled out a jeweler's loupe and examined the image more closely. "The stitching pattern. It's not just decorative. Look at the repetition here and here. These geometric forms, they're consistent with coded textile languages used before emancipation, but..." He paused, shaking his head slowly. "But this is 1872? Why would they need codes in a family photograph after slavery ended?" Dr. Jennifer Okafor, a historian specializing in the Reconstruction era, joined them an hour later. A Nigerian-American woman in her early 40s with sharp, analytical eyes, Jennifer had spent years documenting the violence and systemic injustices that plagued the South after the Civil War. When she saw the photograph, her expression shifted from curiosity to intense focus. "The Reconstruction era was dangerous," Jennifer said quietly, tracing the air above the photograph without touching it. "More dangerous than most people realize. Former enslaved people were being murdered, their land stolen, their testimony silenced. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to help, but they were overwhelmed and often complicit in the injustices." "You think this family was documenting something?" Sarah asked. Jennifer nodded slowly. "If they were, they'd need to be extraordinarily careful. A photograph like this would have cost money, significant money for a black family in 1872. They wouldn't have commissioned it without purpose. The three researchers spent the afternoon scanning the photograph at high resolution, capturing every microscopic detail of the stitched pattern that might hold the key to understanding what this family had risked everything to preserve. The museum's conservation lab hummed with quiet activity as Sarah, Marcus, and Jennifer worked into the evening. They had projected the high-resolution scan onto a large screen, allowing them to examine every thread, every shadow, every subtle variation in the photograph's composition. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a clinical glow, but the image on the screen seemed to pulse with life, with urgency, with the weight of a message sent across more than a century. Marcus had brought reference materials, books filled with documented quilt codes, textile patterns used by the Underground Railroad, and symbolic languages developed by enslaved communities across the South. "Here," Marcus said, pointing to a sequence of diamond shapes along the eldest daughter's collar. "This pattern, 4 diamonds in a square formation. It was used to indicate a safe house, and these triangular forms beneath them..." He flipped through a worn notebook filled with his own sketches and annotations from decades of research. "They represent direction, north, specifically." Jennifer leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "But in 1872, why would they need directional codes? The Underground Railroad had been obsolete for nearly a decade. Unless they weren't trying to escape," Sarah said slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. What if they were trying to hide something, or guide someone to something? Marcus adjusted his glasses and returned to the screen, his finger tracing the intricate lines of stitching. The pattern on the dress was extraordinarily precise, each geometric shape perfectly formed, each line straight and deliberate. This wasn't the work of someone simply decorating a garment. This was intentional communication, painstakingly embedded into fabric that would be photographed and preserved for reasons they were only beginning to understand. "Look at the sequence," Marcus continued, using a laser pointer to trace the pattern from left to right across the bodice. "Diamond, triangle, crosshatch, diamond. Then it repeats, but with a variation. The second diamond has an additional stitch inside it, creating a smaller diamond within the larger one. That's not an accident. That's deliberate modification." Jennifer grabbed a notepad and began sketching the sequence, her hand moving quickly across the page. "That's a specification. It's not just pointing north. It's pointing to something specific located north. A modification in pattern language usually indicates a landmark or a particular location." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Can we map it? Can we translate these symbols into actual coordinates or locations?" For the next 3 hours, they worked methodically, documenting every geometric shape in the pattern, noting its position, size, and relationship to surrounding symbols. Marcus consulted historical textile records, while Jennifer cross-referenced maps of Ascension Parish from the 1870s. The work was painstaking, requiring absolute precision. Slowly, painstakingly, a structure began to emerge from what had appeared to be simple decoration. The coordinates led to a location approximately 2 miles north of where the Freeman family's house would have stood in 1872. Using historical land records and property maps from the Louisiana State Archives, Jennifer identified the site as part of a former plantation called Willowbrook, one of dozens that dotted Ascension Parish during the antebellum period. By 1872, the plantation had been partially divided and sold to various buyers, including several formerly enslaved families who had managed to purchase small parcels of land through the Freedmen's Bureau or private arrangements. "We need to go there," Sarah said, studying the modern satellite images on her laptop. "We need to see what's actually at this location." 3 days later, the research team stood in what remained of rural Ascension Parish, about 60 miles northwest of New Orleans. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that made breathing feel like work. The area had changed dramatically since 1872. Industrial development, highway construction, and suburban sprawl had transformed much of the landscape. But using GPS coordinates, derived from their analysis of the dress pattern, they located the approximate site indicated by the coded symbols. What they found was a small, overgrown cemetery, its wrought iron fence rusted and partially collapsed. Most of the headstones were weathered beyond legibility, sunken into the earth at odd angles as though time itself had pushed them down. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees that surrounded the plot, creating a canopy of shadows despite the afternoon sun. The place felt forgotten, abandoned not just by caretakers, but by memory itself. "This isn't on any official registry," Jennifer said, checking her phone and scrolling through digital archives. "It's not marked on modern maps or listed in parish records. It's like it doesn't exist." Marcus moved carefully between the graves, examining what remained of the inscriptions. His shoes crunched on fallen leaves and broken twigs. Most markers were too eroded to read, but a few retained fragments of names and dates, all from the 1860s and 1870s, all bearing the kind of simple economical engraving that suggested these were the graves of people without significant means, people whose names history had not bothered to remember. Sarah walked the perimeter of the cemetery, following the coordinates more precisely. According to their calculations, the specific point indicated by the dress pattern was located not at any particular grave, but at the northeast corner of the plot, near the base of the largest oak tree, a massive specimen that must have been standing long before the Civil War. "Here," she called out. "This is the exact spot." The ground beneath the oak showed signs of old disturbance, subtle depressions and irregularities that suggested something had once been buried and possibly removed, or that the earth had settled unevenly over time. Obtaining permission to excavate took 2 weeks of persistent negotiations and paperwork. The land technically belonged to a local developer who had purchased several acres for future construction, but the presence of an unmarked cemetery complicated matters legally and ethically. Jennifer navigated the bureaucratic maze with patience and determination, working with the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development and coordinating with local descendant communities who might have historical claims to the site. She attended community meetings, explained their findings, and listened to concerns from people whose ancestors might be buried in that forgotten cemetery. Finally, they received approval for a limited, carefully supervised archaeological investigation. Dr. Raymond Torres, a forensic archaeologist from Tulane University, joined the team. A methodical man in his 50s with decades of experience in historical excavation, Raymond approached the site with appropriate reverence and scientific precision. He established a grid system, marked excavation boundaries with string and stakes, and ensured that every step of the process was documented photographically and in detailed field notes. Nothing would be disturbed without proper recording. The excavation began on a humid September morning. The sky was overcast, threatening rain but holding back. Raymond's team worked slowly, removing soil in careful layers, sifting through each bucket of earth for artifacts. Sarah, Marcus, and Jennifer watched from just outside the excavation area, documenting the process and providing historical context when needed. By midday, they found the first object, a tin box, approximately 8 inches square, its surface corroded but still intact. Raymond lifted it carefully from the earth, his gloved hands cradling it as though it were made of glass. He placed it on a padded examination table and allowed it to stabilize before attempting to open it. The box had been buried approximately 2 feet below the surface, positioned precisely where the dress pattern's coordinates had indicated. "It's sealed," Raymond observed, examining the edges closely with a magnifying glass. Deliberately sealed with what looks like wax or tar to keep moisture out. Whoever buried this wanted it preserved. In the museum's conservation lab the following week, specialists carefully opened the box under controlled conditions: low humidity, stable temperature, proper lighting. Inside, wrapped in layers of oiled cloth that had partially preserved them despite decades underground, were documents, letters, handwritten testimonies, and what appeared to be property records and legal papers. The paper was brittle but legible, the ink faded to a rusty brown but still readable under careful examination. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she used archival gloves to carefully unfold the first letter. The handwriting was educated and precise, written in ink that had somehow survived more than a century buried in Louisiana soil. The letter was dated August 14, 1872, and began, "To whoever finds this, I am writing what I cannot say aloud, recording what the courts refuse to hear, preserving testimony that powerful men would see destroyed." It was signed Ruth Freeman. The documents in the tin box told a devastating story. Ruth Freeman had compiled testimonies from dozens of formerly enslaved people across Ascension Parish, documenting violence, land theft, and systematic injustice during the early Reconstruction years. Each testimony was carefully dated and included the witness's name, their former enslaver's name when relevant, and specific details of crimes committed against them. The precision of the documentation was remarkable. Ruth had recorded dates, locations, names of perpetrators and witnesses, creating an archive that official institutions had either refused to create or deliberately destroyed. One letter described a family forced off land they had purchased legally through the Freedmen's Bureau, their cabin burned in the night, their crop destroyed, simply because a white neighbor wanted their property and knew he could take it with impunity. Another documented a black man named Thomas, murdered by night riders, vigilantes who terrorized black communities after dark, after he tried to register to vote in the 1868 election. Ruth had recorded the names of the perpetrators, all local men who were never prosecuted, and the names of witnesses, too, frightened to testify publicly. "This is extraordinary," Jennifer said, her voice thick with emotion as she read through the documents. "These are first-person accounts from the Reconstruction era, documented in real time by the people who lived through it. Most historical records from this period are written by white officials or northern journalists. We rarely get to hear directly from the formerly enslaved people themselves, in their own words." Marcus examined Ruth's handwriting, consistent, educated, precise. Each letter was carefully formed, each word spelled correctly, despite the limited educational opportunities available to formerly enslaved people. Someone taught her to read and write, and taught her well. That alone is remarkable for a young woman born into slavery. Literacy was illegal for enslaved people in Louisiana. She must have learned after emancipation, but she learned thoroughly. The documents revealed that Ruth had worked with a network of people, collecting testimonies throughout 1871 and 1872. Some witnesses signed their names in careful script, others made marks, which Ruth carefully noted and witnessed. She had documented land surveys, transcribed property deeds, and recorded verbal histories from elderly formerly enslaved people who remembered specific acts of violence and exploitation going back decades, even before the war. But the most chilling document was a list of names, 37 black men and women who had been murdered in Ascension Parish between 1866 and 1872. Next to each name, Ruth had written the circumstances of their death and, when known, the identity of their killers. Some were lynched for attempting to vote or for political activities. Others were shot for insolence or for refusing to work under exploitative labor contracts that were barely distinguishable from slavery. The answer to why Ruth had buried these documents came in another letter. This one dated October 3rd, 1872, 2 months after Ruth had written the first document in the collection. The handwriting was the same, but the tone had changed, more urgent, more fearful. The paper showed signs of having been written quickly, with occasional ink blots and less careful penmanship than the earlier, methodical testimonies. "They know what I've been doing," Ruth wrote. "A man came to our house 3 days ago asking questions, claiming to be from the Bureau, but Father recognized him as one of the night riders who terrorized the Williams family last spring. He threatened us quietly, saying that people who stir up trouble and spread lies about good Christian men often meet with accidents. He looked directly at me when he said this. He knows." The letter continued, explaining that Ruth had been collecting testimonies for more than a year, working with a minister and 2 teachers who had come from the north to help establish schools for formerly enslaved children. Together, they had been documenting crimes and injustices, planning to submit their findings to federal authorities in Washington. But the network had been discovered. The minister's house had been burned. One of the teachers had left Louisiana in fear for her life. "I cannot stop the work," Ruth wrote, "but I cannot keep these documents in our home any longer. If they come for us, they will search everything. They will destroy this testimony, and all these voices will be silenced forever. I have decided to bury the documents in a place only I know, and to create a map that only those who understand our codes will be able to read. If something happens to me, if something happens to our family, perhaps someone in the future will find what we have preserved." Sarah felt a chill run through her despite the warm lab. She knew she was in danger. She knew these documents could get her killed, but she preserved them anyway. And Jennifer's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she read another letter, this one a testimony from an elderly woman named Clara, who described being separated from her children during slavery and never seeing them again. Ruth gave voice to people who had none. She risked everything to make sure their stories survived. Marcus found another document near the bottom of the tin box, a carefully drawn map of Ascension Parish with specific locations marked, each corresponding to one of the testimonies. Places where murders had occurred, where land had been stolen, where formerly enslaved families had been driven out violently. It was a geography of injustice, documented with precision and hidden away for safekeeping. "The photograph," Sarah said suddenly, pulling up the image on her tablet. She commissioned that photograph in June 1872. She was already planning this. She stitched the code into her dress, posed for the photograph with her family, and made sure the image would survive even if she didn't. Finding out what happened to Ruth Freeman required diving deep into fragmented historical records that had survived more than a century of neglect and deliberate erasure. Jennifer spent days in the Louisiana State Archives, searching through Freedmen's Bureau reports, parish records, church registries, and census data. The Reconstruction-era documentation was notoriously incomplete. Many records had been lost, destroyed, or never created in the first place. But Jennifer was persistent, following every lead, cross-referencing every mention of the Freeman name. She found the family in the 1870 census. Samuel Freeman, age 38, occupation listed as farmer. Mary Freeman, age 35, occupation keeping house, and 3 daughters, Ruth, age 14, Alice, age 10, and Grace, age 6. They owned 5 acres of land purchased through a combination of savings and a loan from the Freedmen's Bureau. It was a small piece of property, but it represented everything to a family that had spent their entire lives owning nothing, not even themselves. By the 1880 census, everything had changed. Samuel and Mary Freeman were listed as living in New Orleans, no longer owning land. Samuel's occupation was listed as laborer. Only 2 daughters were listed, Alice and Grace. Ruth's name was absent. Jennifer felt her stomach tighten as she documented this finding. The absence of a name in historical records often meant one of several things: marriage and a change of name, migration to another location, or death. She searched marriage records for Ruth Freeman in Louisiana between 1872 and 1880 and found nothing. She searched immigration and migration records, but given the limited documentation of Black Americans' movements during this period, that search proved inconclusive. Then, In a handwritten church registry from a small African Methodist Episcopal congregation in Ascension Parish, Jennifer found an entry dated November 17, 1872. Ruth Freeman, age 16, daughter of Samuel and Mary, died November 15th. Cause unknown, buried in family plot. Jennifer's hands shook as she photographed the entry. Just 5 weeks after Ruth had written her final letter expressing fear for her safety, she was dead. The cause listed as unknown was a common notation during this period, often used when families couldn't afford a doctor or when the true cause of death was too dangerous to document honestly. Back at the museum, Sarah, Marcus, and Jennifer sat in somber silence as they absorbed this information. The photograph of the Freeman family took on a new, heartbreaking dimension. Ruth stood there in her carefully stitched dress, her expression serious and determined, a young woman who had already decided to risk everything to preserve testimony that the world wanted to forget. She was 16 years old, Marcus said quietly. 16, and she understood that documenting these crimes was worth dying for. Sarah looked at the photograph, at Ruth's face. Do you think they killed her? The night riders? Jennifer shook her head. We may never know for certain, because unknown could mean anything. Illness, accident, violence. The research team knew their discovery couldn't remain confined to academic journals and museum archives. Ruth Freeman's testimony and the voices of the dozens of people she had documented deserved to be heard widely and clearly. Sarah, Marcus, and Jennifer spent 3 months preparing their findings, carefully transcribing each document, verifying historical details, and contextualizing the testimonies within the broader history of Reconstruction-era violence and injustice. They worked with descendant communities in Louisiana, seeking permission to share stories that belonged not just to history, but to living families whose ancestors were named in Ruth's documents. The announcement was made at a press conference in Washington, D.C., held at the National Museum of African American History. The room was packed with journalists, historians, and descendant community members who had traveled from Louisiana. Sarah stood at the podium, the Freeman family photograph projected on a large screen behind her, Ruth's dress and its intricate coded pattern visible to everyone. In June 1872, a 16-year-old formerly enslaved young woman named Ruth Freeman stood with her family for a photograph, Sarah began. At first glance, it appears to be a simple family portrait. But Ruth had stitched into her dress a secret code, a map that would lead to one of the most significant collections of first-person testimonies from the Reconstruction era ever discovered. For more than 150 years, her voice and the voices of those she documented have been buried, literally and figuratively. Today, we bring them into the light. The media coverage was immediate and extensive. Major newspapers ran front-page stories. Documentary producers contacted the museum seeking interviews. Social media exploded with discussions about Ruth's courage and the ongoing relevance of her testimony to contemporary discussions about racial justice, historical memory, and the importance of preserving marginalized voices. But the most meaningful responses came from descendant communities. A woman named Diana, a teacher from Baton Rouge, attended one of the first public exhibitions of Ruth's documents and broke down crying when she saw a testimony from her great-great-grandfather, a man named Joseph, who had described being cheated out of his land by a white neighbor. I knew his name, Diana said, but I never knew his story. I never knew what he survived, what he fought for. Ruth gave that back to us. Marcus worked with textile historians and artists to recreate Ruth's dress, using the photograph as a guide. The reproduction was displayed alongside the original documents, allowing visitors to see exactly how Ruth had encoded the location of her archive into the geometric patterns stitched across the bodice and hem. Educational materials explained the history of coded textiles, connecting Ruth's work to the broader tradition of enslaved and formerly enslaved people using crafts and art as forms of resistance and communication. Jennifer published a comprehensive academic article analyzing the testimonies Ruth had collected, situating them within the context of Reconstruction-era violence and the systematic dismantling of Black political and economic power in the South. 6 months after the discovery was made public, a memorial service was held in Ascension Parish at the small, forgotten cemetery where Ruth had buried her archive. The rusted fence had been repaired, the grounds cleared of overgrowth. Historians had worked with local communities to identify as many of the buried individuals as possible, using Ruth's documents and other historical records. New markers were placed, bearing names that had been lost to time, restoring dignity to a place that had been abandoned and forgotten. Sarah, Marcus, and Jennifer stood among a crowd of more than 200 people. Historians, descendants, community members, and students who had come to honor Ruth Freeman and all those whose voices she had preserved. A local minister spoke about the power of testimony, about the courage it takes to speak truth in dangerous times, about the importance of remembering. Diana, the teacher from Baton Rouge, read aloud from her great-great-grandfather Joseph's testimony, her voice strong and clear. I worked this land for 40 years as an enslaved man, she read. When freedom came, I bought 5 acres with money I saved doing extra work at night. That land was mine, truly mine. But they took it from me with threats and fire. I want it known that I did not give up my land willingly. I want it known that it was stolen." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued, "I want my children and grandchildren to know I fought for what was right, even when I could not win." The crowd stood in silence for a long moment after she finished, the weight of those words settling over them. These weren't abstract historical facts. They were human beings who had loved, struggled, hoped, and suffered, whose stories had nearly been erased completely. Sarah looked at the spot where Ruth had buried her tin box, where she had preserved these voices at immense personal risk. The oak tree still stood, ancient and massive, its roots running deep into Louisiana soil. Carved into a new memorial stone placed at its base were the words, "Ruth Freeman, 1856, 1872. She gave voice to the silenced. She refused to let truth be buried." Marcus stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the memorial. "She was just a girl," he said softly. 16 years old, and she understood that some things are worth more than survival. Truth is worth preserving, even at great cost. Jennifer nodded. "And because of her courage, we now have a window into experiences that official history tried to erase. Those 37 people she named, the dozens who gave testimony, they're not forgotten anymore. Their descendants know their names, know their stories." As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, many stopped to place flowers at the memorial, to touch the oak tree's rough bark, to stand quietly in a space that had been transformed from forgotten to sacred. Ruth's photograph, printed on high-quality paper and laminated for protection, was displayed on a stand near the memorial, her serious young face looking out at all who came to honor her work.